Latina show.
Hosted by IDM.
And I think we are live. Happy New Year, Nina. Happy New Year, everybody.
What
How
does
are
I
you
think
guys
mean?
doing?
What does I think
I
mean?
I think because it looks like we are live. Yes, but I have to double check. Yeah, it looks like we are live on Twitter. Yeah, we are.
Let me see. Let me just get in there on my phone and see if it actually means we're live. Because on my end, it doesn't look like we're live. So
We are live mostly.
perfect. Okay. Yeah. For some reason on
Yeah,
my end, it still has a countdown, but on my phone, it says that I am visible to the niche audience. That
to the niche audience.
the niche audience. Yes.
And
So
that means TikTok has crashed
oh.
and Instagram has crashed. So we are good.
All the unimportant sources are gone.
Exactly.
Welcome to season 2, as Marcelo informed me prior to going live. It's all like one long episode for me. Apparently episode 46. So welcome to season 2 of the Winter Latina show. Marcelo, have you survived the holidays?
Barely, but yeah, kind of.
Barely.
I mean, I don't have that many holidays. Did you survive the holidays? Because you have 3 of them, which, by the way, one of them is today or
Yesterday.
tomorrow, right?
Yes, yesterday. Well, I mean,
Happy New Year from yesterday.
I know. Happy second New Year. Yes. Well, even though there are 2 Christmases, the Western Christmas and the Russian Christmas, and 2 New Years, the actual calendar New Year and the old New Year, I think I only had about 1 day off work, maybe 2. So yes, I've survived, and I'm very well exercised from cross-country skiing last night and swimming this morning. So I'm not as angry as usual. So I'm not sure if that's going to be as entertaining as I normally am, because usually I'm pretty, fist-pumpingly ready to go. Right now I'm pretty chill. So what we want to talk about today is another historical subject. And you guys, for those of you who are actually tuned in right now, Marcelo is essentially walking blind into this episode. I mean, he's obviously seen the title, but we've had no conversations about this. So if he's reacting, he's actually reacting as he normally would. This is an honest reaction.
Exactly. This is as normally would, because usually I'm walking blind here.
Usually. Well, I mean, when it comes to certain current events that we're discussing, you're obviously informed about those. But maybe when it comes to more historical subjects that are outside of your, area of interest, this would be a real walking in blind situation. So our question today is whether the Soviet Union was a traditionalist society. Now, the reason we bring this question up is because there is a huge disconnect between the academia and the public, sort of popular culture. In the academia, this question has been discussed very thoroughly. I mean, there's sort of minor disagreements there, but generally, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, multiple books had come out on this question. However, when it comes to the public, especially in North America, but I feel like there's some influence coming from the so-called conservative circles on Western Europe, the EU primarily, I feel like that is the subject that is completely misunderstood. And I'm not sure that if the people that I'm mentioning here are even interested in understanding it, but also, I don't really care. I'm just going to discuss the subject anyway, because it's one of my areas of interest. But basically, when they talk about anything Soviet or socialist or even communist, usually it's basically something that is a euphemism for I don't like it. There is really no attempt to differentiate between actual historical circumstances versus using labels. And so they look at people today whom I would actually call ideologically left liberal, but because those people would be using certain insignia and calling themselves in a certain way, they're automatically described as, oh, they have a hammer and sickle, therefore they're this and that. And it's completely then misinterprets the actual historical context for the Soviet Union and the types of things that these people promote today, and then they're then criticized by the so-called conservatives, are very, very far removed from the types of social values that the Soviet Union had. So this is why we want to touch upon the subject, to bring a little bit more clarity. And I think it's a very interesting subject as well, in terms of, I think usually culture war is kind of an interesting subject. And in today's day and age, I think what usually gets covered as culture war is kind of like low-hanging fruit, whereas I think historical topics are a little bit more interesting, at least to me. And so the other thing that we want to cover is the term traditionalist, right? Or traditional, because there are all kinds of traditional societies. You know, you can say maybe pre-modern, you can kind of use that qualifier, maybe even early modern. And those societies may have some similarities, but they're not the same. Some of them were more clan-based and tribal, right? Some of them were in Europe. Initially, they were feudal, and then they slowly transformed, developing the middle class. However, in those societies, by and large, patriarchy, which is another term that's really gets thrown around and really without really attachment to anything physical anymore. It just for some people it ends up being a compliment, and for other people it ends up being an insult without really understanding what that means. But we can say that for those traditional societies, patriarchy was one of the qualifiers. What's described today as traditional gender roles, right? Possibly large families. So this is how we're going to define traditionalism, very, very roughly speaking, because it's really kind of hard to attach it to one particular culture. You know, obviously, even in the case of Russia, which is our case study today, that social form has transformed going into the 20th century. So this is what we're dealing with. Marcelo, before we jump into the topic, do you have any opinions about, on the one hand, these conservatives, which sometimes are very reasonable people, but when it comes to this particular topic, it's like they completely lose all their brain cells and become these, you know, amoebas masquerading as humans. On the other hand, you have the blue hairs with various facial piercings who are not really any better. They're sort of two sides of the same coin. I think I kind of expressed my opinion without expressing my opinion on both of those parties that I mentioned. What's your opinion before we jump in?
No, yeah, I first of all, I fully agree with what you just said, and I'm not even going to repeat it because it's so obvious. You know, I think that one of the things that society, one of the big problems of societies, Western societies at least, is this polarization that whatever works for you must be demonized, and the other way around is also true. So yeah, in Brazil, for example, Brazil is a very complex society, in my point of view. It was, at least when I left. So it's a very complex society in this way, because at the same time that we are, you know, we are very blue hair, pierced faced, we are also, you know, going to the church on Sundays, stuff like that. So it's it's a society. I used to say that when I talk about that with my European friends. I think Brazilian society, for example, is a society that's not perfect, of course, but has reached some time ago, and things have changed a bit since I left, but has reached an equilibrium, you know, between super conservative or ultra liberal and stuff like that. So the things were coexisting slightly peacefully. There was no big gap between the blue hair peaceful guy and the church lady, old lady that wears the black widow stuff and stuff like that. And so that's my personal opinion about Brazil. This is a work that we try to do, even together with people that I know that are more conservative than liberal or progressive, whatever. We kind of agree on that. Yeah. Brazil has a decent, trade between the two of them. So that's always a subject that I barely understand as a person, because for me it was always very well coexisting these two sides, and it was simple thing, understanding. Okay, yeah, we can do this, but we can also do this, and we cannot do that, but we can also not do that. It's and here in Europe, I can tell you that this balance is not very balanced. It's Davidson, my friend, you met him. He used to say that the conservatives are the braking of the car, and the liberals, progressives are the full gas. And here it's like full gas, and no, and Brazil kind of walk on the speed limit. That's more or less the idea.
Yeah, it's, at least from what you're saying. I mean, I'm unfamiliar with those social dynamics in Brazil, but it sounds like it's a little bit less polarized than North America or what you're describing about Western Europe. But getting back to Russia, we're not going to talk about the late Russian Empire, but if you look at that society right before 1917, it's a very large country. It's predominantly Orthodox. That's Christian Orthodox, right? That's not the only religion that's there. So, for instance, Poland at this time, right, is part of the Russian Empire, so it's Catholic. You had the Caucasus, parts of which are Christian, parts of which are Muslim. You had parts in Central Asia in the north where there are Buddhists, but all of these religions are being practiced. Despite the differences in religions, the predominant trait is that there are, large families. Large families are considered good religiously, but they're also considered good in a society that's primarily agrarian, right? About 70% farming society at this time, because children are going to help out, right, with the farming work. And so it's practical, but it's also considered good according to various religions that I've mentioned. Education-wise, literacy is really not great at this stage. Obviously, in cities, it's a little bit better. In sort of the more European parts of the Russian Empire, it's a little bit better. But by and large, it requires a lot of improvement because there's no state initiative that we would later see in the 20th century. But generally, it's a socially conservative society. It's a religious society. Obviously, in cities where there is much more industrialization, people might be more economically liberal. I'm not using the term liberal in the way that I would use liberal in terms of ideology. But basically, by and large, it's a pretty socially conservative society. And bam, we have the Russian Revolution of 1917. Discussing the causes is beyond the scope of this particular episode in season 2. And we'll do that at some point. We can do a deep dive into the Russian Revolution. But basically, a lot of socioeconomic issues that were then compounded by the war of 1905, the 1904-1905 between Russia and Japan, and World War I made it even worse. So you kind of had this perfect storm of all of these circumstances. Even before the World War I, around 1912 onwards, there are more and more strikes going on in the big cities. So the social conditions are basically ripe for significant change. And so then the Bolsheviks, which are the most extreme wing of all the parties that exist, and they're sort of the minority compared to others in terms of their ideology, they come into power. They as they're fighting this bloody civil war with different factions of the White Army. At the same time, there's the so-called Western intervention, which I call the invasion, plus Japan, right? So you have Britain, France, the usual suspects, right? The United States, Canada, Japan, coming from two different parts of the now former Russian Empire that has collapsed and trying to gain control of, well, officially they're coming to help the White Army. Unofficially, they're looting all the resources and basically killing the locals. And I did an episode on this separate from the Winter Latina show, if you guys want to check it out in a little bit more detail. And remarkably, the Bolsheviks they also end up losing a lot of land through Brest-Litovsk, right? They lose a bunch of the western lands in the European part of Russia. But remarkably, they end up coming out triumphant in the Civil War, and gradually they end up amassing a lot of the lands that were lost, obviously excluding Poland, excluding Finland, the Baltics, right? That ended up gaining independence up until World War I. And so basically, it's kind of remarkable that they were successful considering how dire the circumstances were. But be that as it may, here you have a group of people coming into power and putting this country back together in the same geopolitical entity, but very different ideologically. So these are, they're officially Marxists, but right off the bat, there is a problem. I don't know how much Marx you've read, but if you've read any Marx, well, you can answer me and then I'll get back into this.
Some I did.
Some. Or it might be, it might not be clear in your mind. But if you've read some Marx, you'll note that when it comes to his writing about the social conditions and the relationship between capital or oligarchy, you can call it whatever you want, and the working class, very, very relevant even today. Very clear, very detailed. If you read it, you think we're talking about, not London in the middle of the 19th century, but today. The accumulation of capital in fewer and fewer hands, billionaires, which is a euphemism, et cetera, et cetera. However, when it comes to Marx and his forecasts, very, very vague, very vague. His forecast about the ultimate statelessness after a social revolution, how the social revolution is going to take place, much, much more vague than his socioeconomic analysis. And so, but one thing, of course, that he did say is that such a revolution is going to occur in a very industrialized society. But that's not what happened, right? We had Russia and we had China, two very agrarian societies where this type of revolution explicitly motivated by Karl Marx occurred, but completely negating what his forecast was. So right off the bat, we have a problem. And of course, Russian revolutionaries led by Vladimir Lenin, some of them are intellectuals themselves, right? They're prolific writers, so they had their own ideas about what would happen. And so when they come into power, they have particular ideas about radically molding the new Soviet society, but at the same time, there is the reality of the situation on the ground. One of the realities, of course, was the economic situation. So right off the bat, Lenin had to start making concessions. He introduced the new economic policy in the 1920s. He died in 1924, so he didn't actually see it play out all the way until Stalin came into power and switched to industrialization. But basically, the new economic policy ended up for partial private ownership, which is very different from, I think, what they were expecting, while controlling the necessary industries by the state. They also allowed foreign concessions. Later in the 20s, this is a time when a lot of American machinery comes into the USSR to basically fuel industrialization, right? Ford, for instance. And so it's kind of an interesting time where already there are debates as to how far they're sort of straying away from the original idea of what they were going to do with this new country. So economically, they're sort of moving away from what they were going to do just to basically guarantee survival, right? Just basic survival of a state. And remember, because of the USSR's ideology, it's essentially this pariah state because some countries don't end up recognizing it to the early 30s, like the United States. So basically, it's surrounded by hostile states, in addition to being in this dire economic situation, which is one of the reasons they introduced a new economic policy. Now, what's interesting to us, of course, is culture war, right? The society and culture of the 1920s. So initially, these Russian revolutionaries are motivated by Karl Marx. Marcelo, can you guess, if you can't remember, what Marx thought about family when it comes to his socioeconomic analysis? For example, gender roles, those questions.
No idea.
You can't
whatsoever. Guess? I can't guess. I can imagine that the families, are base for any society. So I could imagine that, he would have, praised big families, but no idea. I just kicked out of nowhere, took from my, no idea whatsoever.
That's okay. Well, so this is why I'm here to explain it to you guys. Superhero music. Yeah. So basically, Marx viewed morality, family as part of this big superstructure, right? And in the society that he was very critical of. And so because of that, initially these Bolsheviks, right, these Russian revolutionaries were really trying to reform radically the, newly minted Soviet Russia and then eventually the Soviet Union with a different morality. So very early on, they talked about things like abolishing the family unit altogether, because it's sort of the remnant of the bourgeois society that they're trying to get rid of. Some thinkers and activists and revolutionaries, someone like Alexander Kollontai, who's one of the most prominent Bolsheviks in this particular period, she was very, very radical. Now, some of her views, as I'm about to mention them, you'll probably think, oh, she sounds like she lives today. So she sounds very moderate in this sense. And so maybe to our ears, it's not going to sound as shocking, but imagine being in a very, very socially conservative, largely Orthodox Christian society, and all of a sudden there's this chick that comes on the scene and says that men and women are equal in this, not just in the egalitarian sense of, having access to work and having equal rights, but they're equal in pursuing relationships with whomever they want. She was from basically promoting free love, that, women shouldn't be jealous if a man goes off and, finds himself multiple romantic partners, which today, we'll call it, what is it called? Polyamory. But, today we're very jaded. We hear this stuff all the time, but, imagine this is like 1919. 1920. It's absolutely shocking to people who are coming out of a very socially conservative society. Her views about families, essentially, she considered the family unit, again, kind of a remnant of the bourgeois society. And in her ideal society, people shouldn't even live together based on like love or family connections. They should be organized by age. The children should all live in this children's house and should all be communally educated. Then adults of working age should all live together in kind of like a dorm-like scenario. And well, I know, just based on your face right now, it's like, this is a little more radical even compared to...
She invented hippie.
Right. But see, like this kind of thing sounds radical even for people today who are used to hearing all kinds of situations in relationships and so on, so forth. And I think these days people usually have two opinions. They either say, hey, this is great, I want to do this myself. Or they say, you know what, this is freaking gross, but you do you, right? You go off, do whatever you want, and I'm going to do things my own way. People just kind of, there's sort of those two schools of thought these days. But again, remember, this is 100 years ago, coming out of a very socially conservative society. So the whole children's house and a dorm for adults sounds shocking to us today. So imagine how shocking that would have been back then, in addition to the whole idea of free love and abolishing the family unit. Go ahead.
So they burn her. That's the burn the witch. Burn the
Well,
witch.
the interesting thing is that she was one of the most vocal people in terms of promoting this, and she would justify it, based on her interpretation of Marxist ideology. But the interesting thing is that even at this early stage, some of the prominent communists or Bolsheviks were already getting a little bit frustrated with this ideology. So I think as early as 1922, there was I believe it was the 11th Party Congress. They denounced degeneracy using that type of language and basically anti-communist behavior like this. And they were sort of slowly switching gears towards not going back to what they had, but returning to kind of a newly reformed version, repackaged version of a more socially conservative society. So it started happening. Usually people think it started happening under Stalin, but it started happening a lot earlier, because I think for some of those Bolsheviks, and I'm just kind of guessing, they were more doers instead of thinkers. So they were all hyped up and carrying out revolution physically. And now they have this new society. So it's like, what do? I don't think, not everyone was obviously an intellectual like Lenin. So I'm not really sure that they even had access in terms of analyzing some of the social repercussions of what would come from, right, carrying out a successful social revolution per Marxist teaching, or an interpretation of Marxist teaching, I guess I should be more precise there. And so, yeah, that pushback against what they call degeneracy started happening much earlier. In the 1920s, I believe it was right in 1920, they actually legalized abortion. Again, very early, much earlier than other countries. If you Google when other countries have done it, it happened later. But even there, they legalized it, and then they started putting restrictions on them, more and more and more restrictions. And then we'll get to this, by 1936, Stalin completely canceled that out. And it wasn't until the 1950s with Khrushchev who brought that back. And so, again, kind of an interesting parameter to measure social conservatism or lack thereof in terms of looking at the legality of abortion. And we're not going to discuss what we think about this topic. We're just talking about, what that society thought. Again, think about a society that's socially conservative with large families, 6 children, 10 children. They're helping out the smaller children. They're working in the fields. Bam, all of a sudden you're legalizing abortion, which obviously, according to Christian teaching, is not exactly considered beneficial, to say the least. So this must have been very, very shocking to that, to kind of regular people in that society as well, as one of the parameters. Go ahead.
I think it's also I think it's also important to point out that, as you mentioned, we're talking about the 1920s, and the women equality status by worldwide Hague Convention, it only came out in 48. Okay, so until 1948, women were not even allowed to vote in many countries. In Brazil, the rights were different. And we have to have this in mind when we're talking about a timeline.
Yeah, of course. And so the other thing, speaking of women's rights, obviously, like I said, apart from all this, gender nonsense that we just mentioned with Alexandra Kollontai, I think I kind of revealed what I think about her. Oops. There was also kind of more practical issues at hand, right? The fact that women now had access to any kind of employment. They were seen as, equal creators of this new society. And if you look at advertising from that period coming from the state, right? State advertising, you can call it agitation or propaganda. Women and men are portrayed in almost like a unisex way, where women are wearing more masculine clothes. Now you can tell they're women because either from their hair or from some kind of headgear that they're wearing, but they're not portrayed as women that we'll see that start appearing in social advertising and political advertising of the 1930s, where they regain their feminine qualities. So that was also very interesting in terms of social values. And so by the time we get to 1928, right, Lenin had passed away in 1924. This 1928 is the time of the first 5-year plan. And of course, the Soviet Union tried to do these 5-year plans in 4 years. This was absolute, breakneck pace industrialization. If you think about the way countries industrialize naturally, right, big scare quotes, it took them decades. Britain had the first and the second industrial revolution in different centuries. And here is Stalin, who is trying to catch up with capitalist countries. And essentially, the goal here is to overtake them. He focuses on socialism in one country. So his industrialization initiative is very, very fast. In addition to importing some of this technology and specialists coming from Western countries like the US, right, relying on Ford Motors. He is also, in terms of funding that industrialization drive, he is relying heavily on the countryside. Now, obviously, when you're using the supplies from the countryside, that's going to have in some ways negative impact, right, on farming. And so this is the time of 1932, 1933. This is when the big famine comes. That's not the first famine in what became the Soviet Union. There was another famine during the Civil War in 1918. This is the famine that certain Western powers and Ukraine like to politicize as their own. We're not allowed to, on my channel, we're not allowed to use the term that they use because it's ahistoric. This is a famine that impacted not just Ukraine, but basically any agricultural area. So in the Caucasus and southern Russia, what today's southern Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So that was very detrimental. And so having this intense industrialization initiative, plus having the famine, plus having some of this negative impact on agriculture, affected fertility for the Soviet Union. So when we think about these like hero mother type posters, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but usually when people think of those, they think about the post-war period because, we know that the Soviet Union lost 27 million people. Most of them were men. So there was this big drive to have more children. But actually, it starts happening in this early period in the 1930s because of this negative impact, certain negative impact, not comparable to a war, on fertility. So you now have sort of this nascent natalist or pro-natalist advertising of having more children. This is the time when you have women being portrayed in a more feminine way in political and social advertising coming from the States. So very different, like I said, from what we've seen in the 1920s. So it's kind of an interesting time because women still have all of these rights, right, on paper in terms of being able to have any job that they want, including very masculine, right, jobs in factories and so on and so forth, or anywhere they want. At the same time, they're sort of expected, or at least it's considered to be very beneficial that they start expanding their families. Now, how do women work simultaneously and have big families? Well, obviously in this is where the state provides support. The Soviet Union at different times started providing free, before even daycares, like for the littlest children. There is no direct translation of this word. So free daycare, free preschools, long vacations, very long maternity leave. So what throughout Soviet history women ended up doing is that they would have a child, they would be on maternity leave, so their job was safe. Then they would have another child. So sometimes they would be out of work for many years because they were basically using the state benefits to create this large family. And so this is very, very interesting. So this is one of the things where the term traditionalism comes from. And we're going to look at it in a little bit more detail. But before I get into that, I kind of wanted to mention some of the obvious accomplishments, like regardless of what you think of the Soviet Union. One of them was literacy. What I mentioned from the onset is the fact that this was very, very spotty. In the European parts of Russia, in cities, literacy was pretty good. Not so much in the countryside. So illiteracy was essentially eliminated. So now everyone was literate very, very quickly. If you actually think about making everyone literate, being able to read and write in a huge country within a span of like less than a decade. I mean, that's kind of an impressive achievement. The other thing that happened is, of course, as part of industrialization, people had electricity where they never had electricity before. So kind of having basic necessities that, to us, they're basic today. They were definitely not basic back in the day. The other very important thing that happened was the huge reduction of childhood mortality through medical developments. And as part of that, there was an elimination or at least reduction, depending on what the illness was, of very serious illnesses that used to ravage Russia. So basically, you had better education, starting from the basic literacy level, but because education was free, even post-secondary education, people were just gaining that education very easily. You had people who were now healthier. There was, this emphasis on hygiene and medical well-being. That wasn't really quite the case prior to this. And you had more modern technology, right, up to the standards of the first third of the 20th century. So this is basically what happened by 1930s, the middle of the 1930s. These are undeniable achievements. So this is now a very different society, and so people who were living in the countryside, they didn't have access to any of this. Yes, the more privileged, upper middle class people might have some of this. Of course, they were literate and educated, and they had access to better medical care. But that sort of lifting of the masses, again, it's a definite achievement. There's, whatever you think about Stalin or the Soviet Union, there's no denying this. And if you go read any legitimate Western historian, he or she will begrudgingly admit that this is what happened. Marcelo, any comments before I get into the more specific cultural topics?
I think this topic is extremely interesting and important. We have discussed this several times in the channel, including the times before the Winter Latina show that we had done some episodes together. I mean, again, we're talking about the early 20th century. We are in 2025 now, season 2 of the Winter Latina show, 2025. And when I try to explain to Europeans, for example, what basic sewage is, which is a problem in Brazil, it's the lack of basic sewage, it's hard to explain. They lack the capability to extrapolate the minds to a place where you don't have basic sewage. And again, 10 years, yeah, perhaps too fast. Perhaps you can do in 20. We are in 2025. That means that since this century started, we haven't fixed problems that people fixed in the early ages. I'm talking about Brazil on the earlier ages of last century. And yeah, when we think what you mentioned is very important, Brazil is also a very big country. It's not huge as Russia, but it's a very big country. At that time, the lack of infrastructure, it would be very, very difficult to bring, progress to, I don't know, Yakutia or something the other side of the country. We're talking about sometimes more than one continent of size for the same country. As Lucas usually say in my channel, is Russia alone is bigger than Pluto. So it's something to consider. It's bigger than a very small planet. I think it's not a planet anymore. Nonetheless,
no, it's not a planet anymore. It's a dwarf planet. I know it keeps changing its status.
Yeah, I don't like that dude because of that. But anyway, so I can understand that. We are in 2025. We see examples, for example, on China, that they, on the last 20 years, 22, 23 years, they have developed huge railroad system. And in the same 20 years, Brazil have shortened the railroad system, which was already very little. And we're talking about Brazil is a country that industrialized much earlier than China. Actually, the Chinese went to Brazil to learn. I know we're talking about Russia. It's important to picture other rounds. The Chinese went to Brazil to see what was being done in the middle of the last century. So Brazilian people, see, the guys did the obvious, which is literacy, health, and
Education.
education.
Like higher
And,
education, higher
yeah,
education.
I just said literacy because it's already the basic. 100 years ago. What are we waiting for? But yeah, that's a very important picture for me to make.
Yeah, so the baseline, right, for a functioning society was now very, very different. And one of the key moments was efficiency, right? So hygiene, cleanliness, right, medical well-being and cleanliness. Now, some historians take cleanliness and take it farther, and they talk about ideological cleanliness, right? So, I mean, this is something that could be discussed in this particular context. But I think what we're going to focus on is that transformation of family values, where it was this interesting blend. Some people do use the term patriarchy to describe what happened in the 1930s onward, where the woman was, expected to work outside the home, but at the same time, she was expected to have a large family, take care of the family. And yes, the state provided all of these perks to help her do that. But I guess one of the criticisms of using that particular term is that the new patriarchs did not have the same property rights that the patriarchs of the past would have had. And you can kind of go both ways on this particular question, whether it's important. I think when you focus on property rights, that kind of shows your own ideology, that you're sort of coming from a liberal capitalist perspective, and as opposed to more of a socialist or something outside the three ideologies of modernity. And so that traditionalism existed, of course, in a top-down way. So it's not something, right, that came right on its own organically. It was sort of reinstituted from the top, but of course initially it was pulled apart from the top as well. So one of the terms that historians use is neo-traditionalism, right? Because it's a top-down traditionalism that is being disseminated by the government instead of this organic development. But they would still be using the term traditionalism in this modern context, right? When we say modern, we don't just mean the present, we mean the particular period of modernity. Now we're technically living in post-modernity, we're past that period. And so where everything was becoming more efficient, industrialization, right, is one of the features of it, but the idea of cleanliness, hygiene, education, efficiency, where you're a good citizen of a state, this sort of all was incorporated into this one package of a Soviet citizen. And so, yeah, in this regard, gender roles, I think, are pretty interesting. That drive towards natalism, like I said, continued with newly renewed force after World War II because of the huge population losses. So this is when you had the introduction of the hero or heroine mother concept. And that would be not just women that biologically produce children, they could also adopt to qualify, because of course there are lots of orphans after World War II. And so basically there were various rankings for this, and you can get various state awards and perks if you were to qualify with, 6 or more children, 8 or more children. And the 10 children or more was sort of the upper limit for being a hero mother. And this continued all the way until the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And these days, there's sort of this kind of updated idea of this in Russia, where large families are being promoted, not just with financial perks, but also in the media. But it's not packaged quite in the same way, and I think it's a sort of a related but separate topic that we can jump upon later. And some historians, when they think about this topic, they think about essentially creating this good servant for the state. But I think it's kind of interesting because the USSR is not alone in this regard. I mean, if you look at the dismal demographics in the European Union, yes, there are two ways to solve it, either to have more children or to import immigrants, which is another can of worms. In some ways it could be beneficial, in many other ways it's detrimental, which of course is what we've seen with, lack of assimilation initiatives, yada, yada, yada. Again, a separate issue. But it's kind of funny to me when I see these historians kind of isolating the Soviet Union, where the idea of having a good citizen of a state in the EU, this would be a good taxpayer that would continue funding the welfare state programs that the EU has. It's exactly the same. It's just in a different context. But that idea of being a good citizen and serving the state is no different in the socialist USSR of the 1930s and 40s and 50s, et cetera, right? And in the EU of 2020s. What do you think?
Well, we can remember the words of JFK. Ask not what the country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, right? So yeah, I think I mean, a society is a bunch of rules that are veiled that we don't actually know. It's not just the law, but there's also rules of living among each other the good citizen, the good worker, the person that will follow the law, because the law it's important. Liking it or not, yeah, we can change. It's not perfect. Nothing's perfect. We can argue always to change something, but it's not just, I'm not going to obey because I disagree. And I see, for example, again, bringing Brazil to the table. One of the big problems of the country is that people simply don't regard the law and the social. I'm searching for a word for this that would define it better. The social contract. Yeah, the social contract. There's a lot of disregards. You mentioned this situation, and of course, this is not a subject for today about the importing people. That was a very rude word that I saw on a newspaper a couple of weeks ago. German wants to import people from Africa or something like that. I say, so we're back to legalizing this kind of work. But okay. One of the things is that societies, they have, the Brazilian society has a different a different dynamics than the American society, the European society, the African society. And when you bring everything together too fast, because at the same time, as I was talking in the beginning of the episode, one of the things that I think brings this equilibrium on Brazilian society, it's exactly the mixing of it. You have Europeans, Africans, Indian Americans, people from everywhere, Asians. You have people from everywhere, a lot of cultures, but this dilutes on time. This is not a one punch stuff. Now today you have just one punch migration movement, and then you don't integrate these people, and then they do not feel part of that society, so they do not adapt to that society. And yeah, I think that the situation on the good citizen, on the good taxpayer, or ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. This is important.
And it's not unusual. Again, it's completely not unusual for the Soviet Union. Another feature of being a good citizen and, developing greater social cohesion was much like you had, anti-drug advertisement in the last few decades. You had, pro-sobriety advertising. Again, this was part of the greater health drive, but it was anti-alcohol consumption and pro-sobriety. Again, being a more productive citizen. Now, obviously, in the workplace, the most productive workers were lauded. Stakhanovites were part of a movement. They were not just producers, they're super producers that just exceeded all expectations. They're awarded and lauded, but they they were basically used as an example set for everyone else to try to get to their levels of performance, again, as part of being a good citizen. Another important feature was not just literacy and post-secondary education, it was the overall issue of culturedness. Being cultured became very important. And this is where there is this resurrection of classical literature that comes back into the Soviet Union at the school level, where it's heavily promoted and advocated for by the state. So in the 1920s, of course, you had lots of revolutionary poets and writers that were matching the spirit of the time. But in the 1930s, you almost have this retro return to some of the most famous, poets that we can think of today, like Pushkin, for instance. And so that was also very interesting, where that was part of culturedness, being well read. And personally, to me, it sounds like a great thing, where people who are not necessarily intellectuals or academics, they're expected to be well read in the classics, which certainly is something that's missing from today's society. But yes, this was something that was heavily promoted from top down. And as part of that, there's another thing that's related to this particular topic, and it's something that we've mentioned when we discuss the former Soviet republics, and that is the fact that in these former Soviet republics, especially in the 1920s, there was this promotion of using locals and elevating them to positions of power. We talked about this happening in Ukraine, but it happened in every single Soviet republic. So each republic basically ended up having its national author or poet. And these people are still considered, in Ukraine, this would be Taras Shevchenko. He is still considered to be, this great poet, but it was very, very much promoted by the Soviet Union. So God knows where he would be if it weren't for this concerted effort by, the Soviet government to promote him as the local, or they would use the term national, right? National poet for the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The same thing happened for Georgia with their own national poet, et cetera, et cetera. So that was also very interesting. This is kind of a side issue, but this is one of those ticking time bombs, right, that were sort of embedded into essentially creating a little nation within the borders of the Soviet Union that had all the precursors of being a nation, but it was done artificially. Again, I'm not saying that these poets didn't exist, but the way they're promoted and elevated to this amplified status and promoted all across the Soviet Union was strictly from, coming from the Soviet government. It wasn't coming from these regions. So that was definitely part of culturedness too, in addition to reading classical literature. And the other thing that was interesting, and it really became amplified during World War II and after World War II, was the kind of a selective resurgence of national heroes. And of course, they were sort of being rebranded based on what was needed at the time. I think the most famous example is Prince and Saint Alexander Nevsky, right, who kicked the butts of Teutonic Knights a couple times. He kind of was, not hostile to the Mongols. He tried to basically make things better for the Russians during the Mongol occupation. But this is when you had movies coming out during World War II, where there was the parallel between, Alexander Nevsky in the 13th century fighting the Teutonic Knights, i.e. they were not actually Germans, but they're basically kind of rebranded as the Germans, right, versus World War II. So there was that parallel. And so Eisenstein, right, released his famous movie. And so there was this need for national heroes to basically garner some kind of patriotic support for various issues. And again, to me, the way that some historians talk about this is kind of maybe unusual. To me, it's not really any different than any other country rebranding their particular hero depending on what's necessary at the time. If you think about Joan of Arc, she was a Christian hero, she was a French hero, she was a feminist hero. So depending on who gets their fingers into that particular historic personality, they become rebranded based on whatever time period we're dealing with. So, in this regard, the Soviet Union was no different. It sort of resurrected some of these heroes and used them in, state promotion, let's say, to garner support for the war effort in the early to mid 1940s. So that's another issue here. What do you think before I get into the next one?
No, I was thinking that it's common in Brazil that we say that Brazilians kill their own heroes. At the same time, in history we study people that now that I'm starting to peek into some historic black holes. I don't think we should study them the way we should. You know, separatists like heroes. Uh, it's never a good thing to have separatists as heroes, right? Someone that we have the hero of the two continents. You know, uh, he was a troublemaker in Brazil. We should not praise the guy. Oh,
So
yeah,
are you
perhaps
saying we should study them more historically accurately instead of just kind of amplifying them as a symbol of something?
as a symbol of something. Yes, yeah, of course. There were struggles, but those people there were real struggles. You know, there were problems there. But those people are nothing but separatists. They just wanted to put their
Separate.
hands
They
on
were
the gold.
separatists.
Yeah,
They wanted to separate.
they just wanted to have their piece of the pie, and not exactly to keep a unity. And this is something that it was fought for a long time to keep. A huge country needs to be fought to be kept huge, otherwise it separates. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I mean, I go back and forth on this question. I think heroes and symbols are necessary, but I think people who are educated, they probably know that the symbol that they're reading about is probably somewhat sanitized. I mean, it's much like looking into the biographies of famous authors. I mean, I kind of have regrets about reading the diaries or the stories about personal lives of some famous Russian authors like Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, like the most famous ones, because when you start kind of seeing them as real people, they're deeply, deeply flawed. And sometimes they're so flawed that you kind of find it like, oh my gosh, this person is actually awful. They're super talented when it comes to literature, but I wish I never knew this about them because it's awful. So I think it's kind of a double-edged sword when it comes to national heroes, or it doesn't have to be like a military hero. It can be someone like a famous writer or whatever. So yeah, we kind of have to be careful there because there is the possibility of being really disappointed. And I think symbols, humans are religious animals. They have an imagination, and so there needs to be that dimension to life. It's not just materialism. So I think heroes are necessary. So in this regard, again, the Soviet Union is not surprising. But yeah, we kind of got to be careful with some of these individuals. And the other thing that was very interesting is the fact that there was a little bit of a resurrection of religion. And, again, usually when people think of the Soviet Union, they think of it as being as an officially atheist state, which it was. And there was a persecution of the church in, a little bit on the 20s, but especially in the 30s. But by World War II, but also even in the late 1930s, there was a little bit of a return to that. Again, the church was now sort of more, not just the church. I have to mention that this pertained to other religions too, like Islam. So for instance, they would allow an image of a mosque at kind of like a state fair. But there was this conscious effort to now, again, the church was subordinate to the state. It wasn't separate from the state. It wasn't equal to the state. There was no competition. The church was definitely subordinate. So I'm not making that claim. But it was now sort of allowed once again in certain parameters. So the church was being used to, motivate people at the front to fight. And again, I think this is a really interesting comment about Stalin being a very shrewd politician. He understood what would work in terms of propaganda and agitation, what would actually rouse people's feelings, but he also understood what people truly wanted, and he gave it to them. And so in this regard, it's sort of an instrument, but again, it's also kind of a way of understanding what you people want, and you're ruling over these people essentially, right? So it's really an interesting dynamic to me in this regard. Much like these early 1930s advertisings about, the drop in fertility where people need to have bigger families, again, this was instrumental. Yes, the state needs more people, but again, it sort of talked to people in a way that they were used to. They're used to having big families. They're used to having traditional family values. So there's sort of this modern instrumentality coming from the top-down way, right, coming from the state. But there's also this understanding of what people truly wanted, the kind of society that they operated within and the kind of society they came from. So in this regard, the types of things that happened in the 1930s and the 1940s during World War II, there was sort of this weird return, not quite a return to the traditionalism, right, of the late 19th, early 20th century of the late Russian Empire, but it definitely was a lot closer to what the early Bolsheviks were trying to do in the early 1920s. And so this is what we refer to as neo-traditionalism. Now, of course, it's something that wasn't completely stable throughout, the entire Soviet history. One example I already used was Khrushchev reintroducing or re-legalizing abortions, but the idea of a hero mother and the need to have bigger families in various ways that the Soviet Union maintained that type of propaganda, positive natalist propaganda, up until its dissolution. The emphasis on culturedness, the emphasis on education and being a good citizen by being educated and being a hardworking, contributing member of society, all of those things sort of stay generally maybe slightly fluctuating up until 1991. And so some historians look at this as sort of a betrayal of the revolution. And this idea happened very, very early on. As soon as it started happening with the economic concessions in the 1920s, some ideologues would talk about a betrayal of the revolution. And of course, some historians would perceive it in this way as well, but especially with Stalin's 1936 constitution that I already mentioned, that basically took away a lot of these policies that the early Bolsheviks introduced prior to his rise to the top of the Soviet power. But other historians kind of look at it as like I said, more in an instrumental way, where this actually made sense. And this made sense in terms of giving the Soviet people what they wanted and bringing it closer to the type of society that they wanted. So it wasn't so much a betrayal of the revolution, it was actually kind of de-radicalizing it to the point of making more sense, right? And now in this society, the new, modern, hygienic, well-educated, cultured Soviet citizen could function a lot better because it was a little bit closer to where he or she came from, but at the same time, it was repackaged in this modern context. Go ahead.
Yeah, one thing, while we're talking about, one thing that kind of pisses me off is that there's always this thought of, the revolution did not work because A or B betrayed the revolution. And no, it was not perfect. They were somewhere in a terrain that they had no idea what they were doing. They were creating new stuff and having to deal with new problems, with new issues, with new difficulties. For example, as you mentioned, there was a down on the fertility for a long time, and they say, "Oh crap, we need more people." What are we going to do? And we see people making mistakes today in this era. Imagine that time with not the easy of information that we have today, and that brings me always to the point that looking at the present, we are entering a period of time, new period of time, with all this multipolarity and BRICS, NATO, United States, capitalism, that we don't know what's going to happen. But today we have means to understand. And one thing that I think is kind of important to have in mind is that it's no problem for us as human beings to ditch some of our knowledge, our previous knowledge, and say, okay, this is new. This is going to be new. Perhaps this is not going to work. And let's get what we can use from this, because it's important. It's there. Some of it has been proven good or right. Some of this didn't work. One thing that when you mentioned this cycle, what seems like a very, very natural cycle on history is exactly this. You have some full gas on liberalism or progressivism, and then things started to go to hell.
Yeah, I mean, it's the French Revolution, right? You have the revolution in 1789, and then you have a really violent response to it. So in this regard, it's really not surprising that it's like the pendulum is going to swing one way really far, but then it has to come back. But I think in terms of culture, it's really interesting because kind of like the way I introduced this topic, where some of these, especially American conservatives, the way they think of the Soviet Union, they think they're a bunch of these gender neutral pronoun people running around in, the 1930s. And it's just, it couldn't be any farther from the truth. Again, think of what you will of the Soviet Union, but this was a society that, if you take away that state component, which is important, it was essentially a neo-traditionalist society with family values, with women being expected to, produce more children, with, men being good husbands, with people being cultured in the traditional, storytelling and literature of the country, et cetera, right? Like, this is, if you don't tell these people what you're talking about, they'll say, yeah, this sounds really great. And then you'll say, by the way, this is what happened in the Soviet Union. They're going to flip out because it's just, such cognitive dissonance for them. And so this is why I wanted to introduce the topic the way I did. I don't think I'm going to reach these people. I don't think they're my audience, but well, maybe one of these days we're going to sit them down, Clockwork Orange style. We're going to peel their eyes and we're going to make them listen to a lecture.
With silver tape.
Yeah, I know, but we're going to make them listen to a lecture on Soviet cultural and social history from this period. But yeah, it's much more nuanced, and it has changed, right, after after Stalin's death. But it's definitely, just like one thing we can say for sure, it's definitely not what they think it was. And so maybe they kind of have that hunch about the early 20s where there was some of that going on in terms of, we must abolish the family unit. But it was really coming from particular individuals. It wasn't really coming from the overall state. It was coming from some of these more radical, right, intellectuals, basically in the early Soviet society that were pretty prominent, which, again, that's completely unsurprising. That actually tells you that the society was probably more pluralistic than you might think it was, despite the violent way in which it came into power and despite, the state control of the country. So yeah, this is why I wanted to bring this topic. I briefly looked at the chat box. There is a lot, but I don't know if there are any questions that we haven't addressed. So before we depart, Marcelo, do you want to let me know if there are any questions or if it's just comments?
Well, I think I saw most comments. A lot of Happy New Year for us, and there was one for Happy Second Anniversary. So that's the second season. Thank you guys for that. Yeah. Let me see. There was one last comment from Who Cares?
No blue hairs invading my chat box, or American conservatives threatening to send me to the Bible Belt or something.
No, I was interested for this comment, the overcorrections, and that's exactly the pendulum that you were talking about, and that was one point that there's these memes, there's these very famous memes, when you have, for example, I don't know, Iraq or Kuwait or whatever, these Middle Eastern countries, and then you have this country on the 70s, and then you have ladies in swimsuits going to the beach, and the next image is now with Islam, whatever they want to blame, whatever they want, and then you have the women in burqa or niqab.
No, and this meme has been taken over and showing like South Korea and other countries
and North Korea, I think. Yeah.
It's really been. No, they did
But
it with South Korea, I think, with
South Korea.
the coup attempt. Yeah, I
Wow.
think it's now a thing that has been memed
But
in terms of countries
exactly.
where it's not applicable, basically.
But the point is exactly to that. You have two images. People pick two pictures, perhaps not even from the same place, but you have two pictures, and then you completely ignore the movie. You have a timeline. You have invasions. You have societies going out of the limits that they consider themselves to be tolerable, and then they push the brake very hard, and that's when they go super conservative or extra traditionalism. So we see the comment I would like to make, just to finish um, my participation, I guess, is exactly that. We are still living in this crazy cycle. And we had here in the show Nicola Mirkovic that, for example, said that inside France, people are getting more Catholic, are going back to go to the churches. So yeah, this is a conservative movement going inside France, and Italy has been always a very Catholic country, and has perhaps gotten a little bit of equilibrium there. And that's where I was talking about Brazil. We were always a very Catholic country, but we also have Carnival, the
Sure.
most beautiful on the planet. So I think that this equilibrium is what we should be looking for. And instead of
what I think is
going
it's
through
interesting
cycles.
because we have a very particular definition of democracy, and then of course anything that happens outside of the rules-based order today is considered not democracy. But I think it's interesting looking at the way this particular government was essentially giving people what they want. Now, again, yes, this was a state-controlled environment, but by giving them culturally and socially what they were craving, like, is that not a definition of some form of democracy, right? Where you're trying to hear the people and give them what they want in this particular regard. Again, I'm not saying the Soviet Union was a democratic society in the way that we would view maybe, a society with elections, et cetera, in the 21st century. But when you're actually looking at these things and you're not just radically transforming them, but you're trying to pull out these very deep, profound things that are under the surface that are important to people, I think this is something that could be described as a form of, I don't know.
Wait. I don't know what happened to your sound.
Uh-oh. Can you hear me
got
now?
Muted somehow. Can you please? I don't
Yes.
know. Do you guys hear Nina in the chat? Because I don't hear you anymore.
Okay, well, we can wrap it up, Marcelo. That's okay.
Yeah, no, I hear your sound. The software sees your sound. I don't know why I don't see your sound.
Okay.
So perhaps I should.
Well, why don't we wrap this up, because I'm being invaded by my dogs, which is, I think, Okay, I'll wait for you to finish.
My page.
Okay, I'll wait for you to finish. Okay, my dog was gonna come and greet you guys, but he decided not to do that. Okay, wait, hold on a second. He might come back. But yeah, I think we might wrap it up. Oh, here he comes.
Yeah.
You want to say Happy New Year? I don't know if they can see you. Can they see you? Come here.
It's faulty.
Come here, giant basset hound. There we go. You're the biggest attraction of the show. Who cares about Soviet neo-traditionalism? Oh my God. Who cares about Soviet neo-tradition? I know, this is ridiculous. Who cares about Soviet neo-traditionalism when we have a giant basset hound who looks so sad? He's not sad. He just looks very sad. Look at this. Is this not a ridiculous creature? This is an absolutely ridiculous creature. Well, Marcelo, we can wrap it up now.
By the way, you have a super chat from Nazia Sali. So glad I found you, Nina. I've been learning so much about Russia and appreciate your content.
Thank you. I appreciate the super chat, which I can't see because I'm being crushed by a giant basset hound. Oh, and next week, you guys, fingers crossed to have a special episode if everything works out. So be sure to come back next week. I think you're going to like it. It's not just going to be me blabbing, which I know we like me blabbing, but in this particular case, it's not going to be me blabbing. Well, thank you. Thank you. Happy New Year. Happy second New Year. And we will see you in the next one. You want to say bye-bye? Cool.
Happy New Year, everybody. Say bye-bye, guys. And remember, you can always help the channels by Pix to Brazil or buy Nina coffee and super chats. And all the links are on the description. You can follow Nina on YouTube, Twitter, Rumble a little bit. And see you guys next week. Bye-bye, Nina.
Thank you. See you soon.
Bye-bye.